Armand awoke to the suffocating darkness of his chamber, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and decay. His eyes snapped open, and for a moment he was disoriented, his mind clawing its way back from the abyss of a nightmarish slumber. The room around him was familiar yet distorted. Heavy velvet drapes shrouded the windows, sealing out the moonlight. The walls, once adorned with the faded elegance of his mortal life, now seemed to close in on him, pressing in with a malevolent intent. He sat up, the ancient stone of his coffin scraping against his back. A wave of dizziness washed over him, followed by a flood of memories that were not his own. They were fragments of horror, glimpses of pale faces twisted in fear, eyes wide with terror as they stared into the darkness that had consumed them. He could hear them screaming, their voices merging into a cacophony that reverberated through his mind. Armand pressed his hands to his temples, trying to force the voices back into the depths where they belonged. But they would not be silenced. They clawed at his sanity, tearing at the thin veil that separated his consciousness from madness. He stumbled out of the coffin, his limbs heavy and uncooperative, as if they had been asleep for centuries. The room swayed around him, the shadows twisting and writhing like serpents. He reached for the candelabrum on the nightstand, his fingers trembling as he struck a match. The flame sputtered to life, casting a flickering glow that pushed back the darkness, revealing the room in all its grotesque familiarity. The ornate mirror on the opposite wall stared back at him, its surface warped and cracked. Armand's reflection was barely recognizable, a gaunt figure with hollow eyes and skin stretched taut over sharp cheekbones. He looked like a specter, a remnant of the man he once was. He tore his gaze away, unable to bear the sight of himself. His throat burned with a familiar thirst, the hunger gnawing at his insides like a ravenous beast. Yet, this time it was different. There was an edge to his craving, a frantic desperation that threatened to consume him entirely. He needed to feed, to sate the hunger before it drove him to madness. But as he moved toward the door, he hesitated. The manor was silent, too silent. Usually he could hear the faint creaks and groans of the ancient structure settling into the earth. But now, there was nothing. It was as if the entire house was holding its breath, waiting for something. He placed his hand on the door, and a chill ran down his spine. The wood felt cold, almost alive, as if it were breathing beneath his touch. He pulled his hand away, staring at the door with mounting dread. He needed to leave, to escape this prison of shadows and memories. But something held him back, a voice at the back of his mind whispering that the true horror lay not in the manor but within himself. His hands trembled as he turned the handle, pushing the door open. The corridor stretched out before him, a yawning chasm of darkness. He stepped forward, his bare feet silent on the cold stone floor. The hallway seemed to stretch endlessly, warping and twisting with each step he took. The walls were lined with portraits of his ancestors, their eyes following him with accusatory gazes. Their faces blurred and shifted, melting into the visages of his victims, their eyes wide with fear and mouths open in silent screams. He turned away, his heart pounding in his chest, a cold sweat breaking out across his skin. Armand quickened his pace, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He needed to find the exit, to escape the suffocating labyrinth his home had become. But no matter how far he walked, the corridor stretched on, the darkness swallowing him whole. Panic rose within him, a primal fear that clawed at his throat. He was trapped not by the walls of the manor, but by his own mind. He stopped, doubling over as a wave of nausea washed over him. The walls around him began to pulse, a rhythmic beating that matched the frantic pounding of his heart. The portraits on the walls warped further, the faces contorting into grotesque parodies of humanity. They whispered his name, their voices a chorus of condemnation. "Armand," they hissed, Murderer, monster. He covered his ears, sinking to his knees. The hunger inside him twisted into a sickening knot, his need for blood tainted by the horror of what he had become. His vision blurred, and he was back in the past, standing over the lifeless bodies of his victims. He could feel their blood on his hands, warm and sticky, the metallic scent filling his nostrils. He had taken their lives without remorse, driven by an insatiable need that now threatened to devour him from within. A sob escaped his lips, a raw, guttural sound that echoed down the corridor. He was losing himself, his sanity unraveling with each passing moment. The shadows around him writhed, reaching out with skeletal fingers, grasping at him with cold, bony hands. He could feel them pulling him down, dragging him into the abyss where his darkest fears resided. "No," he gasped, struggling against their grip. I am not a monster." But even as he spoke the words, he knew they were a lie. He had been a monster long before he became a vampire, a creature of the night. The darkness had always been a part of him, festering in the corners of his soul. He had merely given it form, allowed it to consume him until there was nothing left of the man he once was. The shadows tightened their grip, pulling him deeper into the darkness. Armand thrashed, his mind fracturing under the weight of his own horror. He was drowning, sinking into the depths of his own madness. And as the last remnants of light faded from his vision, he heard the voice again, whispering from the shadows. "Embrace it, Armand," it murmured. "Embrace the darkness." And he did. With a final shuddering breath, he let go. The shadows enveloped him, swallowing him whole. In that moment, he felt a twisted sense of relief, a release from the torment that had haunted him since his awakening. He was the darkness, and the darkness was him. The corridor fell silent once more, the whispers fading into the void. The manor stood still, its ancient stones bearing witness to the descent of its master into the abyss of his own making. And in the depths of that silence, a new horror was born, one that would haunt Armand until the end of time. He was awake, and the nightmare had only just begun. Armand roamed the manor like a phantom, his movements erratic, his senses dulled by the relentless bombardment of his own mind. Days bled into nights, and the passage of time became a cruel blur. His once impeccable sense of control, honed over centuries, was slipping through his fingers like sand. He could no longer distinguish the walls of his ancestral home from the labyrinth of his psyche. Both seemed equally vast and impenetrable. In fleeting moments of lucidity, he caught glimpses of the world beyond the manor's oppressive confines. The village lay at the edge of the forest, nestled in shadows as thick as the fear that now gripped its inhabitants. The villagers had become wary, their whispers carried to Armand on the wind. They spoke of the increasing darkness in the woods, the haunting cries that punctuated the night, and the eerie glow that emanated from the manor, as if it were a living entity feeding on the darkness. Armand ventured into the village at nightfall, driven by hunger and a desperate need to reclaim some semblance of his former self. The familiar predatory thrill of stalking his prey surged through him, yet it was tainted by something new: hesitation. As he approached a young woman wandering the village outskirts, her lantern casting trembling light on the cobblestones, Armand felt a sudden surge of panic. Her face, serene and unknowing, began to morph before his eyes, becoming that of another woman, one he had fed upon centuries ago. His vision warped, the night around him distorting, as if reality itself recoiled in horror. He could see them now, all of them. The faces of his victims, their eyes filled with terror, their mouths agape in final, silent screams. They crowded around him, their presence palpable, their forms shifting and coalescing into a mass of wraith-like figures. Armand staggered back, a guttural cry escaping his lips. The villagers turned, their eyes widening at the sight of the figure in the shadows. He fled before they could see him for what he truly was. his mind unraveling with each step he took toward the manor. Back within the walls of his sanctuary-turned-prison, the madness grew. The manor seemed to breathe, its walls pulsating in rhythm with his racing heart. Each room he entered twisted into a distorted reflection of his past, filled with objects that held pieces of his memories. The dining hall, once a grand place of mortal feasts, now lay in ruin. The long table was strewn with decayed remnants of forgotten banquets, the goblets overflowing with coagulated blood. He saw his victims seated around the table, their lifeless eyes fixed on him, their mouths whispering accusations he could not escape. Monster, fiend, parasite. Armand clutched his head, the words burrowing into his mind like parasites. He retreated from the hall, fleeing into the corridors that seemed to stretch and warp, leading him deeper into the manor's bowels. He found himself in the gallery, its walls lined with portraits of his human life. They gazed down at him with stern disapproval, their painted eyes following his every movement. His father's portrait, stern and unyielding, loomed over the others, his eyes a mirror of the disappointment that had haunted Armand since childhood. "You were always destined for darkness," the portrait's lips moved, the voice cold and hollow. "This was who you were meant to be." "No!" Armand shouted, his voice echoing through the gallery. He backed away, his eyes wide with horror as the other portraits began to whisper in unison, their voices rising to a fever pitch. He stumbled, crashing into a pedestal, sending a marble bust of his mother shattering to the ground. The sound of breaking stone reverberated through the hall, a stark contrast to the cacophony of whispers that filled his ears. Armand ran, his footfalls muffled by the thick layers of dust that coated the floors. The manor shifted around him, the hallways elongating, twisting into endless spirals that led nowhere. He was trapped in a maze of his own making. Each corner he turned, revealing only more darkness, more reminders of the monster he had become. He was losing himself, his identity fracturing under the weight of his own self-loathing. It was then, in the depths of the manor, that he first saw her. At the end of a long corridor, bathed in the pale light that filtered through the cracked windows, stood a figure. She was young, dressed in the simple garb of another time. Her eyes, wide and filled with a mixture of sorrow and accusation, locked onto his. Armand's breath caught in his throat. He knew that face, though he had not seen it in centuries. "Anna," he whispered, his voice trembling. She was the daughter he had lost, the one he had left behind when he embraced his dark nature. She stood there, a silent specter of his past, her presence both a comfort and a torment. "Father," she spoke, her voice echoing in the emptiness. "Do you remember what you were before you became this?" Armand stumbled toward her, his hand outstretched. Yes, I remember, but it's a memory shrouded in darkness. I was weak, powerless." She shook her head, her form wavering as if it were made of smoke. "No, you chose this path. You embraced the darkness because you feared the light within you." Her words pierced him like a dagger. He stopped, his hand falling to his side. "I did what I had to. I had no choice." "There's always a choice," she said softly, her eyes filled with an emotion he could no longer name. "But you were too afraid to face yourself, to face the man you were becoming." Armand fell to his knees, his body racked with silent sobs. The hunger inside him roared, an ever-present reminder of what he was. But now it was mixed with something else, regret, guilt, the echoes of a humanity he thought he had long since extinguished. Anna stepped toward him, her hand reaching out to touch his face. He felt nothing but the coldness of his own skin, a stark contrast to the warmth he remembered from his mortal life. "Is this real?" he choked out. "Or just another torment of my mind?" She smiled, a sad, fleeting expression. "Does it matter? The truth is not found in what you see, but in what you feel." and you have forgotten how to feel." With those words, she faded, dissolving into the shadows that crowded the corridor. Armand was left alone, kneeling on the cold stone floor, the weight of her words pressing down on him. He was trapped, not just within the walls of his manor, but within the prison of his own mind. The descent into madness was not the result of some external force, but a reflection of the darkness that had always resided within him. He rose slowly, his legs unsteady. The hunger gnawed at him, but for the first time, it was not the hunger for blood that consumed him. It was the hunger for absolution. A futile desire, he knew, for there could be no redemption for a creature like him. Yet, the fleeting presence of Anna had sparked something within him, a faint ember in the void of his existence. Armand wandered the manor, his movements aimless, his mind a battleground of memories and hallucinations. He entered the library, its shelves filled with tomes of forbidden knowledge. He sought answers, a way to understand the nightmare that had become his reality. But each book he opened only revealed more darkness, more reflections of the monster he had become. The words on the pages twisted and danced, forming images of his victims, their blood staining the parchment. He slammed the books shut, his frustration mounting. There was no escape, no salvation. He was condemned to this endless descent, a spiral into the depths of his own psyche. He saw her again in the corner of his eye, just a fleeting glimpse. Anna, her eyes filled with that same mixture of sorrow and accusation. She was everywhere and nowhere, a ghost haunting the corridors of his mind. Armand collapsed into a chair, his hands covering his face. The walls of the library began to close in, the shadows creeping toward him. He could feel them reaching for him, their cold fingers brushing against his skin. He was losing himself, his identity dissolving into the darkness that surrounded him. The manor was no longer just a physical structure, but a manifestation of his inner turmoil. Each room, each corridor, was a reflection of his fractured psyche. He was both the predator and the prey, the hunter and the hunted. And as he sat there, enveloped by the shadows, he realized the horrifying truth. The descent into madness was not an external force assailing him, but the inevitable outcome of his own choices, his own nature. He was the nightmare, and the nightmare was him. The manor had become an ever-shifting maze, a living entity that fed on Armand's torment. Each night, the walls twisted into new forms, corridors opening and closing like the veins of a monstrous heart. It was as if the house had fused with his mind, manifesting his darkest fears and memories. But somewhere within this maddening labyrinth lay the answers he sought, the truth behind his curse, his existence, and the entity that haunted his every step. Armand descended into the manor's depths, drawn toward the cold, damp air that seemed to emanate from its bowels. The basement had always been a place of secrets, a forbidden realm even for him. He had avoided it for centuries, sensing that it held a darkness even he was not prepared to face. But now, with his sanity unraveling, he knew he had no choice. If he were to reclaim his mind, or at the very least, understand his suffering, he needed to confront whatever lurked below. The descent was slow, the steps slick with moisture and rot. The air grew colder, and the walls around him dripped with a foul-smelling liquid that oozed like blood from an open wound. His senses heightened, every creak and whisper echoing in the dark passageway. The deeper he went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became, pressing down on him with a weight that made it difficult to breathe. At the bottom of the staircase, Armand found a door. It was ancient, made of warped wood and iron bands, covered in strange symbols that seemed to pulse with a life of their own. He reached out, his hand trembling as he touched the cold surface. The symbols glowed faintly, reacting to his touch, and the door creaked open with a low, mournful groan. He stepped inside and was immediately engulfed by darkness. It was not the absence of light, but something tangible, a living void that coiled around him, pressing into his skin and mind. He felt the presence of the entity here, a malignant force that had been haunting him since his awakening. It whispered to him, its voice a blend of his own thoughts and the cries of his victims, a cacophony that threatened to tear his sanity apart. At the room's center stood an altar, ancient and covered in a thick layer of dust and decay. Upon it lay a book, bound in what looked like human skin, its pages yellowed and brittle with age. Armand hesitated, feeling the malevolent power that radiated from the tome, but he forced himself forward, his fingers brushing the cover. An electric shock jolted through him, and for a brief moment, he felt as though he was connected to the manor itself, to every stone, every shadow, every whisper that had tormented him. He opened the book, and the pages seemed to breathe, exhaling a foul stench as they revealed the secrets written within. The text was in an archaic script, one he recognized from his studies in the dark arts before he became a vampire. It spoke of ancient rituals, forbidden knowledge, and a curse that bound not just a man but his very soul to the fabric of his surroundings. Armand's eyes widened as he read, the truth unfurling before him like a nightmare come to life. He learned that his vampirism was not merely a curse inflicted upon him, but a binding ritual, one that tied his existence to the manor, forcing him into an eternal cycle of horror and madness. The ritual was designed to strip away a person's humanity, to lay bare the darkness that resided within them, and make it their prison. The manor, in its twisted, sentient form, was an extension of himself, a reflection of his inner torment and depravity. Armand stumbled back, the book slipping from his hands and falling to the floor with a dull thud. The room around him seemed to pulse, the shadows closing in as if they were hungry for his despair. He realized now that the entity haunting him was not a ghost or some external demon, but a fragment of his own psyche. It was his humanity, twisted and vengeful, taking form to confront him with the atrocities he had committed. He sank to his knees, his mind reeling with the revelations. Every moment of his existence had been a lie, a construct of this ancient curse that had bound him to a life of predation and bloodlust. The hunger he felt, the madness that gnawed at his sanity, was not just the result of his vampiric nature, but the manifestation of his suppressed guilt and self-loathing. He had become his own jailer, the manor his prison, and the entity his executioner. In the depths of his despair, the room began to change. The shadows shifted, and from the darkness emerged the figure of his daughter, Anna. She stood before him, her face a mask of sorrow and accusation. Armand looked up at her, his eyes wide with horror and grief. "Anna," he whispered, his voice cracking. "What have I done?" She gazed down at him, her eyes filled with a pity that cut deeper than any blade. "You embraced the darkness, Father. You allowed it to consume you because you were too afraid to face what lay within your own soul." He shook his head, his hands trembling as he reached out to her. "I had no choice. I am a monster." "No," she said softly, kneeling before him. "You were a man who made a choice. The monster is not what you are, but what you became when you refused to face the truth." Armand felt tears burn his eyes, a sensation he had not felt in centuries. The truth she spoke of was one he had buried deep within himself, locked away behind the facade of his vampiric nature. He had justified his actions, his thirst for blood, as the result of a curse, an external force that had taken away his humanity. But now he saw the horrifying reality. The curse had merely exposed what had always been there. "You were a man of cruelty even before the darkness took you," Anna continued, her voice a whisper that echoed in the cavernous space. "The vampire did not create the monster. It only revealed him." Armand's mind shattered under the weight of her words. He saw flashes of his mortal life, moments of cold ambition, ruthless decisions, and a hunger for power that had led him down a path of moral decay. The transformation into a vampire had not been an imposition, but an amplification of the darkness that already resided within him. The room around them warped, the shadows becoming more aggressive, lashing out at him with tendrils of blackness. Armand cried out, the darkness piercing his mind, showing him visions of his past, every life he had taken, every soul he had condemned in his quest for power and immortality. He saw their faces, felt their fear, their pain, and he knew now that these memories were not the result of the manor or the curse. They were his own, the legacy of his monstrous nature. "How do I escape this?" he pleaded, his voice breaking. "How do I break free?" Anna looked at him with a mixture of sadness and resolve. "There is no escape from what you are, Father. There is only acceptance. You must confront the darkness within you, not as a vampire, but as the man who chose this path." Armand recoiled, his mind recoiling at the thought. Acceptance meant acknowledging the monster he had been long before he became a creature of the night. It meant facing the truth that the horror he lived was not an external curse but a reflection of his own soul. He had become the architect of his torment, the master of his own demise. The entity that had haunted him, the voice that whispered in the dark, was not an adversary but his own conscience, twisted into a form he could neither accept nor defeat. And now it stood before him in the guise of his daughter, demanding that he look into the mirror of his own soul and see the truth. The shadows surged forward, engulfing him. Armand screamed, his voice echoing through the chamber. He felt himself being pulled into the darkness, into the very depths of his mind. Memories flooded over him, a torrent of his sins, his fears, his endless hunger for power and blood. And in the midst of it all, he saw himself, not as a vampire, but as the man he had once been. The figure in the shadows, his doppelganger, emerged before him. It was him, yet not him. A twisted, grotesque parody of his own visage. Its eyes gleamed with malice, its mouth curled into a smile that spoke of all the horrors he had inflicted. It was his true reflection, the embodiment of the monster he had become. "Welcome home," it hissed, its voice a chilling echo of his own. "You cannot escape me, for I am you." Armand felt the last vestiges of his resistance crumble. He was forced to confront the deepest, darkest truth of his existence, that he had always been the darkness, that the manor, the entity, the curse, were mere reflections of his own twisted soul. The only way to end the nightmare was to accept this, to embrace the darkness within and let it consume him. He closed his eyes, his body trembling as he gave in to the truth. The shadows wrapped around him, pulling him into the abyss. And in that final moment, as he was swallowed by the darkness, he felt a twisted sense of peace. For the first time in centuries, he was free, free from the lies, from the facade, from the torment of denying what he truly was. He was the monster, and the monster was him. The manor was in ruins, its once grand halls now nothing more than hollow shells filled with darkness and decay. Armand stood in the center of what used to be the grand hall, the place where his mortal life had ended and his monstrous existence had begun. The air was thick, oppressive, carrying the scent of centuries of death and despair. The walls groaned and shifted, as if the manor itself was writhing in the throes of its own madness. He had faced the truth of his existence, the reality that he was not a mere victim of a curse, but the author of his own damnation. He had spent centuries blaming the darkness for what he had become, but now he knew that the darkness had always been inside him. The manor, the haunting, the entity that had pursued him, it was all a manifestation of his own twisted soul. As he stood there, the shadows around him began to take shape, coalescing into the form of the entity that had tormented him from the moment of his awakening. It was a reflection of himself, yet more monstrous, its eyes burning with a hunger that echoed the void within him. This was his final confrontation, not with an external force, but with the darkest part of his own psyche. The entity stepped forward, its movements fluid and unnatural, like a creature born of nightmares. Its lips curled into a smile that sent a shiver down Armand's spine. "You cannot defeat me," it hissed, its voice a chilling echo of his own. "I am you." I have always been you." Armand's hands trembled at his sides. He had been both the predator and the prey in this twisted game of his own making. He had fought against his nature, denied the monster he had become. But now there was no more room for denial. The truth was laid bare before him. The only way to end this torment was to confront the darkness within, to embrace it and, in doing so, extinguish it. "You feed on my guilt, my fear," Armand said, his voice steady but laced with an undercurrent of anguish. "But what happens when there is nothing left for you to consume?" The entity's smile widened, its eyes gleaming. "You cannot simply wish me away, Armand. I am the sum of every sin, every act of cruelty you have ever committed. You may embrace me, but you will never control me." Armand felt the weight of its words, the truth in them pressing down on him like a vice. But there was something different now, a spark of resolve that had been absent before. He had spent centuries as a slave to his own darkness, letting it dictate his every move, every thought. But now, standing here, he realized that he had the power to end this, not by defeating the darkness, but by accepting it and letting go of the fear that had bound him. He took a step toward the entity, his gaze unwavering. "You are right. You are a part of me, but you are not all of me." The entity recoiled, its eyes narrowing. "What are you doing?" it snarled, its voice laced with anger and fear. "I am taking back what is mine," Armand said. "I have feared you, loathed you, and let you define me, but you are just a fragment, a shadow cast by my own fear, and shadows can only exist in the presence of light." With those words, Armand reached out, his hand piercing the darkness that surrounded the entity. It screamed, a sound that shook the very foundation of the manor, a scream not of pain, but of fear. The entity writhed and twisted, its form becoming unstable, as if the very act of being touched by Armand's resolve was tearing it apart. "You think you can escape what you are?" it hissed, its voice breaking into 1,000 echoes. "You will always be the monster." Armand stepped closer, his eyes locked onto the entity's. "I was the monster, but I am also the man who chose to confront that monster." The room around them trembled, the walls cracking and crumbling as the manor reacted to the battle taking place within its heart. Armand could feel the structure groaning, the shadows retreating into the corners, no longer swirling with the same malice. The entity before him began to dissolve, its form becoming translucent, its edges blurring as it fought against the inevitability of its own demise. "You cannot kill me," it whispered, its voice now weak and desperate. "You cannot kill the darkness." Armand nodded slowly. "No, I cannot kill you, but I can accept you, and in accepting you, I can move beyond you." With that, he embraced the entity, pulling it into himself. The darkness surged into him, filling him with a cold that reached into the marrow of his bones. He felt its rage, its fear, its insatiable hunger, all of it crashing against his resolve like a tidal wave. But he held firm, drawing it into himself, not to let it consume him, but to integrate it into the whole of his being. The room around him exploded with light, blinding and searing. The shadows screamed and writhed, dissolving into nothingness as the light burned away the last vestiges of the entity's form. Armand fell to his knees, his body racked with convulsions as the darkness within him fought for control. But he held on, his mind a battleground where he refused to yield. He had spent centuries fearing the darkness, but now he faced it not as a monster, but as a man. And in that confrontation, he found the strength to overcome it, not by destroying it, but by acknowledging it as a part of him, a part that no longer held power over his soul. The light faded, leaving Armand kneeling in the center of the ruined grand hall. The manor was silent, the oppressive presence that had haunted its halls now gone. He was alone, truly alone, for the first time in centuries. He looked around, his eyes adjusting to the dimness, and saw that the shadows were just shadows now, empty, hollow things that no longer held the malevolence they once did. Armand rose slowly, his body weak, but his mind clearer than it had ever been. He walked through the manor, each step echoing in the stillness. The portraits on the walls no longer whispered accusations. The mirrors no longer reflected his monstrous visage. They were just remnants of a past that had been laid to rest. He reached the front door of the manor, the door he had not crossed since his awakening. He hesitated for a moment, feeling the cold air seep through the cracks. Then, with a deep breath, he pushed it open. The night greeted him with a cool breeze, the scent of the forest beyond wafting toward him. Armand stepped outside into the world he had once haunted. The moon hung low in the sky, casting its pale light over the landscape. He felt the familiar hunger within him, the vampire's thirst that would never fully disappear. But now it was a part of him, a part that he understood and controlled. He did not know what the future held for him. He was still a vampire, still a creature of the night, but he was no longer a prisoner of his own mind. He was free in a way he had never thought possible. He had faced the darkness within himself, and in doing so, had found a way to live with it. Armand walked away from the manor, its silhouette fading into the darkness behind him. He did not look back. He had faced his final confrontation, not with an external enemy, but with himself. And he had emerged not as a monster, but as something more complex, an entity that existed in the gray space between darkness and light. As he vanished into the night, the manor stood silent and empty, its walls now mere stone and wood, devoid of the malice that had once haunted its halls. And somewhere deep within its ruins, where the darkness had once thrived, there was now only silence. For the first time in centuries, Armand knew peace. It was a fragile, uncertain peace, but it was his. And in that peace there lay the faint glimmer of hope, a hope that perhaps, in the end, even the darkest of souls could find their way to redemption.